You know how I start episodes by asking questions. Here's my question for you. What is Barbie's character arc in the movie?
Oh, oh, so this episode's about arcs.
Like
Yeah,
his arc or just Barbie's arc?
I think it's about Barbie's dream house, which
Ooh.
goes through
And
its own arc.
it does. It does go through its own arc. So maybe before we start talking about Barbie's arc, let's define what is an
And stay
arc.
tuned if you want to hear more. We'll discuss it at the end and try to figure out like why does it work or doesn't work, and what our arc is. So, Teresa, yeah, explain to us what are we talking about? What is this concept?
So an arc is how a character changes throughout the book, and it does this beautiful U shape. So character starts off, let's use Barbie. Let's just start. Barbie starts off happy. She is happy. She is content. Her life is perfect. It's a party every night and girls' nights. But things happen and she arcs and she changes. And then where does she end?
Happy.
She does.
But
She does.
a different kind of happy. A different
happy.
kind of oblivious. She's not obliviously happy anymore.
Exactly. A happiness where she chose. And by the way, if you haven't watched Barbie, sorry, spoilers. Go watch it. It's excellent. But where she made choices about where she ended up. And maybe she's not able to wear the pretty shoes and everything else that she was wearing. And maybe she's going to eat too much and get fat. And maybe she's going to start getting wrinkles and everything else. But it was her choice at the end of the day.
Here's my other way to explain it. You know, fundamentally, when you think about a story involves your character wanting something. And your character can't just have what they want. Because if they just had what they wanted, the story would be over.
There's no story.
Right? There's no story. The story would just be over. They would go out, they would buy their favorite pair of shoes, and it would be over.
There's no story.
Right? There's no story. The story would just be over. They would go out, they would buy their favorite pair of shoes, and it would be over. So for some reason, their character doesn't just have the thing that they want. Well, in order to get the thing that they want, whether it's existential or a physical thing, right? They need to do something to get it. And oftentimes that process of doing the thing to get what they want changes them. Because if they would stay the same, they can't get what they want fundamentally, typically in a story. There are exceptions, but you know, if let's say they want to get rich and they haven't gotten rich their entire lives. Well, fundamentally, they must have to change something, do something different in order to be rich or in order to get the favorite pair of shoes or to whatever. They might have to change their behavior in order to get what they want, or it might not be even a behavior change. They go through a journey and that journey changes them. So that's what we're talking about with arcs.
Yeah.
And that make more sense?
It did. Yeah, no, that was good. And we're also talking about stakes. So stakes, it was a previous episode. So make sure you go and watch that one so that you kind of understand this concept of how your character would gain and then also lose from getting what they want. So let's talk Barb. Oh, go ahead, Morgan.
One of the things I think when we're talking about arc that is why it's important. So I think one of the questions that I have is like, why does the character need to change? Like, send them on an adventure, have fun, cool stuff can happen to them. And I think one of the things that causes us to love story is that when we get to read other people's stories or listen to people's stories, we're learning. We're thinking, what would I do in that situation? How am I as a person? And so when we read stories, it's a study of character. An arc is an opportunity for us to take a moment and be, what is our connection? What is our character learning about themselves? And do I want them to arc up and grow as an example? Or do I want them to arc down and be a different kind of example? I guess they're both examples. So
yeah,
it wasn't great, but
And one of the most, you just touched on it, I think one of the most powerful character arcs that oftentimes gets looked over is the devolution of a character.
Mm.
It's when we talk so often about having a flawed protagonist who then arcs somewhere, they become a better version of themselves, they learn something about themselves, that kind of stuff, which is great, I really love stories where, yeah, a character maybe does start flawed and then they succumb to their flaws, right? This is classic Greek tragedy, but you sit there and they're learning about themselves and you're learning about the human condition. And you're just sitting there and the tragedy is going to happen, but you can't look away and you're still sitting there and you're like, Oedipus, no, Oedipus. But what's happening. It's like an inevitability. Anakin becomes Darth Vader. These things. And there's so many examples out there, whether it's that or Oedipus or any Greek tragedy, a lot of the Shakespeare tragedies, Othello, whatever you have, the tragedy is coming. Romeo's going to die because he's dramatic. And every time you read it, you're like, no, just wait 5 minutes for her to wake up. Just wait and it'll be fine. But he never does.
Well,
he never does.
But it's also villains' origin stories too. And Disney's been playing around with that so much. You've got, Maleficent and Cruella de Vil, watching these characters go from a place of, they were okay, but bad stuff happened and they went and embraced the bad. They became villains.
Which is such an interesting commentary on arc. So let's go back to Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is a case of Romeo not arcing at all. He starts in the beginning talking about Rosalind and being impatient. Being overly, the opening scene is him in love with Rosalind, not Juliet. And he's impatient and he can't handle himself and he allows that rambunctiousness. And that becomes,
he just focuses on Juliet. Yeah.
And so the epic there, the goal there is, if you don't overcome your impatience, if you don't overcome your impetuousness, your desire, your hyped up libido, if you don't overcome your hatred for other families, if all these people's flaws, they hold in Romeo and Juliet all the way out, and their flaw becomes their demise because they don't arc. So it's still a lesson on arc done in a really interesting way.
Also, TV shows, when characters don't arc, they get stale. Yeah. And you kind of hit that point where you're like, yeah, look, there's Michael Scott being Michael Scott. He hasn't changed at all. There's Dwight being Dwight, funny, but I don't really care anymore. You like those characters much better in the early seasons, if we're talking about The Office, than the later seasons.
Yeah.
And the later seasons is because they try to force them to arc.
Yes.
Because they run out of things to be original, because they're not changing. But then you see some of the really long-standing ones, and we're not endorsing any of these, but I grew up on Friends. It was my college show. Like, we all watched it. It was the thing. And I understand some of the things are very outdated now. I get it. But that's what I grew up on. And each season got better and better and better.
Yeah, it did. But their characters changed a lot.
Changed a lot.
They grew.
Monica got less crazy because Rachel learned to be on her own and not so codependent, which is where hers started. And now she's a single mom doing it and making it, Ross, who always needed a woman, is stepping back for a minute. And so these issues of family independence and control, which is a lot of what Friends is about, who needs control of what and how do they find their place in the world, they did start arcing out of things. But that's, I think, a season people were still on board. When they
I think with Friends as well, they did it gradually and in a way that made logical sense. Right. So, and we're talking now about TV shows, which is very different than books often. Like, it's a very different format. It's a very different structure.
Way to bring us back, Molly, because I was just going to keep going. I was going to bring up How I Met Your Mother, but
these are valuable studies in character and character arcs. But for a book, typically, you write a book, you write a story, and that might be part of a greater series in which your character might have an overarching character growth across a series, but they might have a sort of mini arc in a book, right? You might have a study in that specific book. Morgan.
I was just thinking I'm going to argue that the quintessential character arc book is Scrooge.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be
that's
like,
easy.
if you're looking at, where did arcs come from? Why are they effective? How do they hold their timelessness? I really think the miser to the philanthropist is, very iconic.
One of the brilliant things with Scrooge, and one pitfall that I think happens, is people think that their character has to arc. They want their character to start off being this Scrooge, and then they want their character to end up being this great guy, philanthropist, whatever. That's a big jump. It's really a lot of space between the two. And so you have to do if you're covering a lot of ground, you got to do a lot of work in order to make that arc believable. And Scrooge, Christmas Carol does a great job because literally he is shown his own death. He is shown listen, you're going to die and nobody will care. There is a lot. It's really, really it does a lot of heavy lifting. I think that there are some people, have trouble here is they want to cover a lot of ground, but then their character the incidences which make their character change aren't big enough to elicit the change that occurs.
So let's fulfill the promise that we made early on. Let's talk about Barbie's arc. So we already know she goes from plastic happiness to genuine happiness.
Yeah. And I think talking about what I just talked about, how do you get that meaningful arc? Well, it's two things. It's one, you have to know why your character is the way that they are fundamentally. And it's two, making sure that the conflict and the climax then matches that so you get the change you want to see. So a technique we wanted to give you for the first part is a real industry technique. Engineers use it. It's called the 5 why technique. And basically you ask why until you come to a root cause. So Let's look at Barbie. What do we want to start with? Something observable. Barbie's heels fall down. Teresa, why do her heels fall down? Why did she get flat feet?
Because she's thinking, she's connected to a character who's thinking about death.
Why is that character thinking about death?
Ooh, because she's getting older and her daughter is growing up and she's starting to see that she could end up being alone. Her daughter's going to leave and she's going to be alone.
I mean, ideally, you wouldn't have gotten to the really good stuff at the end
No,
fast, but Teresa did, so it's great.
You can still go why farther.
All right, why down there from Morgan? Give us more why.
Yeah, you can still keep going. Don't stop.
Go, Morgan. Go.
Right. So Teresa, you ended with because she was going to be alone, right? So why is she going to be alone?
Oh, good point.
Well, she thinks she's going to be alone because she thinks as she ages, she's not worthy. And because as she ages and society gives her this message that women who don't look a certain way or act a certain way aren't worthy, she accepts the narrative, which causes her to hold on to those flaws.
Why, Morgan?
I would argue because most people in society right now are, and the author recognized that and wants it to be a theme of self-acceptance. And so the author is trying to get us to say, look, father time or mother time is going to beat every one of us. We're all going to age. We're all going to grow old. We're all going to get flat feet. But that doesn't make us unlovable or unworthy. And then
unworthy of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting when you look not just at Barbie, but at the other characters. One of the other main characters in that story is Ken. And Ken's arc mirrors Barbie in a lot of ways because it's the same like root causes.
Mhm.
The same, like he is fundamentally unhappy because of the pressures that society has put on him.
He's beach. His job is beach.
Yeah. So he's fundamentally unhappy and he has to find his place and who am I? Where do I fit in? How can I be happy without the constraints of Barbie, without the constraint of society, just happy as me? And it's the same kind of acceptance, happiness story, just played out in a different arc, right? It's a different character, a different arc, but it's the same fundamental like desire and theme.
And this takes me to one of my favorite things that I always say. There are no new stories. There are just new ways to say them. So Barbie and Ken have very, very similar arcs. Or excuse, I'm going to rephrase that. Well, they do. They have very different, they have similar arcs. But how they get there, how they get there is very different.
So I think then we talked about the first part of this. Okay, where are they at? Who are they? What do they want? Why can't they have what they want? That kind of thing. And now we have to mirror that, or how we have to pair that with a perfect climax. Right? It doesn't make sense. We can't get them to change unless we give them a perfect conflict and climax that makes that happen. Morgan, I know this is your bread and butter. What do you have on this one?
I think what makes it interesting, any story, like go back to Scrooge too, like include him too, because what we've kind of laid the foundation here is that their arcs are similar, and I want to go to opposing arcs that come back to the climax too. So the idea in the climax is that you match the opposing, whatever our protag and antag is, whether it's a bear and a mountain man, whether it's Ken and Barbie, whether it's society and Barbie, whether it's Father Time and Scrooge, whoever it is, right? Whatever you pair, that conflict needs to put them equally at odds so there's a tension that can pull back and forth so they can arc out of whatever it is. And it's in that tension that they're able to arc out of it because we want to feel the arc is hard. We want to feel the change is hard. Mm-hmm. If all of a sudden you just wake up and go, okay, I'm happy.
No, that's great.
Well, that's not a story. I mean, I would love that. But
well, we talked about you. There's a reason that people can't just, you don't get what you want, you know.
Mm-hmm. And since we don't live it, we don't want to see it in story. And oftentimes we want to see in story more of a struggle than we even have.
Yeah.
Because in that struggle, it pulls at our heartstrings and it pulls at our own struggle and it connects us to the page and it connects us. And if we give that payoff too early, if we give that arc too early, if we give that climax too quick, then people close the book with a lot of lack of resolve. And this is really common even with excellent authors. There's so many good authors that books 2, 3, and 4 were just all like, ugh. And it's because they didn't set up their two forces tight enough to arc around the conflict.
Molly's brain just exploded.
I had a brain explosion because you were talking about antagonists and protagonists and what makes a story good. And it's not, I love what you're talking about with the tension. I love that. But something else above and beyond, right? So many times we talk about the villain being redeemed. How do you redeem a villain? Who is actually a villain in the end, right? And I think oftentimes, this is my brain moment, if the villain changes, overcomes their flaw, then we don't see them as the villain in the end. Right? Like Ken is an antagonist for most of the story. But because at the end, he adapts, he changes, he overcomes his flaw to become a better person, essentially. I don't know that he's a better person, but he's more accepting of himself. Then we relate to that. We see that. We understand his struggles. We don't see him as a villain anymore.
Yeah.
Scrooge, same.
Scrooge is the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Even
his shirt,
Darth Vader.
I am Kenough.
Yeah.
Darth Vader, great example.
Yeah. And even though, like, I think there's a balance act of like, you can't just forgive their crimes when they were a villain, but you can see them as a reader, as a consumer, you can see them more as a real character and as a real person. And then sometimes you have the devolution, right? Like you want the character, you want even the antagonist to succeed, or at least maybe not succeed, but change and be better. And you see glimpses that they could be better, but then they ultimately aren't. And they ultimately fail to like, that's
arc.
Kylo Ren through the first movie that he's
Yep.
in, right? We want him to be better. We want him to be better. Spoiler, then he kills his dad. Right? That's that moment. And it's compelling. We want people to be better than they are. So
But
often.
I will also argue that the reason that Kylo had to die at the end is because he was redeemed, but where do you go from that?
Yeah,
How do
I
you
think that's a
like
different
that
story.
character?
That's a different
Yeah.
story there.
But
But yeah,
anyway,
just had a brain about character arcs and how your protagonists and your antagonists are really intertwined, and why really powerful books have this like interesting, their character arcs are related.
mhm.
And there's a tension between their character arcs, and you can really play on that as a storyteller. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you. This was amazing. And I'll bet our characters watching this have arced out of this episode and they are ready to go look at their protagonists and antagonists and arc them towards each other for the epic climax of writing your book.
Go
So
right.
do it.
Yeah, go right. We'll see you later. Bye.